So thank you all for joining us tonight for Up in Flames, Living with Fire Throughout Illinois History. My name is Sarah Davis, and I'm the Public Programs Educator at the Illinois State Museum. And without further ado, I will turn it over to the Illinois State Museum History Curator, Erika Holst.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for everyone for attending today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And today we are talking about Up in Flames, Fires and Firefighting in Illinois History. And we are talking about that tonight because 150 years ago tomorrow, a house started in the barn of this building that was at 127 DeKoven Street in Chicago. This was the rental property of an Irish immigrant family headed by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. So the fire started in the barn. Ironically, the house survived because the fire blew and grew away from the structure. And they were living in a neighborhood of very closely packed wooden houses. And so the fire started spreading. And this became what we know today as the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And so this fire was fueled by strong winds. It quickly spread north and east to the city center and beyond. It actually jumped the Chicago River twice. First, it leapt across the south bank, then it leapt across the main bank, burned up wooden buildings along its way. It burned up the gas works, and so the city was plunged into darkness without gaslight, burned up the water works, burned up a bunch of buildings that were thought previously to be fireproof. And I want to read you a description of a woman named Anna E. Higginson, who was actually there at the fire in 1871, because I think her words do justice better than anything I could ever say to what it was like in this fire. Anna says, "The wind, blowing a hurricane, howling like myriads of evil spirits, drove the flames before it with a force and fierceness which could never be described or imagined. It was not flame, but a solid wall of fire which was hurled against the buildings, and the houses did not burn, they were simply destroyed. The flames would dash themselves against the side of a solid block, in one instant passing out the other side, and the whole just melted away and disappeared. The courthouse burned in 20 minutes, while that long block of 40 houses on LaSalle Street opposite Lincoln Park burned in just 7. The air was full of cinders. Pieces of blazing shingles and boards and great strips of tarred felt fell in every direction, now on the roofs of houses yet unburned, and then on the loads of furniture and bedding which people were trying to save and which they were continually obliged to abandon in the street in order to save themselves." So when all was said and done, the fire had left more than 300 people dead. It had destroyed 3.3 square miles of the city, which was a third of the city. It had burned 15 out of 16 bridges over the Chicago River and left 100,000 people homeless. It destroyed more than 17,000 buildings and 73 miles of street. So that map on the left there shows the extent of the burn district of the Chicago fire, and the images to the right are images of the rubble that was left behind. So in the aftermath of this story, or this fire, a story began about who was to blame for the Great Chicago Fire. And I think we all know, you can go ahead and throw it in the chat if you want to, what started the Chicago Fire? That's right, the lore was that it was Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. She was the owner or the renter of that house that I first showed you, and the story was that she was out milking her cow at 9 p.m. and the cow kicked over a lamp and started the fire. This is almost certainly not true. And 40 years after the fire, there was a Chicago newspaper reporter who admitted that he and other 2 reporters made up the story because they thought it, I don't know, sounded snazzier. This isn't before it ruined poor Mrs. O'Leary's life. She was scapegoated. People said terrible things about her. There were horrible caricatures about her in the press. She really spent the rest of her life trying to lay low and avoid the limelight as much as she could. She was a convenient scapegoat because she was frankly a woman and an Irish Catholic, and those were 2 groups that were really kind of targeted and ripe for satire. What really started the fire is unknown. There are several theories. One, it might have been a stray ember from a nearby chimney. One of the neighbors is thought to have maybe slipped into the barn to have a drink of milk and smoking and dropped his cigar and started the fire. Some people have even suggested that it might have been spontaneous combustion. But what we do know about that October in Chicago was that it was very, very, very dry. There had been only about 2 inches of rain that had fallen in the previous 3 months. In fact, the week before the Great Chicago Fire, there had been about 20 smaller fires. And the night before the Great Chicago Fire, there had been another fire that was larger size. So really this fire that happened in Chicago could have happened anywhere in similar conditions. And actually it did often in the 19th century. So we're going to dig into what fire looked like in daily lives of people in Illinois in the 19th century. And the basic thing about it is that fire was everywhere. Fire was a big part of daily life, much more so than in our lives today, because people depended on open flames for light and heat. So it was something that people lived with. They learned how to manage. Sometimes it got away from them. The first chore that most people did in their household, especially in the colder months, was light the fires in their fireplaces or light the fire in the kitchen stove. The last thing they did before going to sleep at night was blow out the candle on their bedside. So the whole day is a process of managing these fires for light and heat. So what can you do to minimize your risk of fire? Well, one of the most basic things to do is to build a house with non-combustible material, to build in brick or stone rather than in log or frame. This would help the spread of fires if buildings are close together, but it's not a foolproof way of preventing fires because a lot of the brick and stone buildings of the time are basically just wood piles in non-combustible walls. They've got wooden framing, they've got carpets and textiles, they've got wood in the rafters, wood sashes, cornices, gutters. So a brick building can burn every bit as much as a frame house. It's also somewhat cost prohibitive. Brick and stone cost more than frame houses. And so a lot of people, in fact, most people elected to build in frame. And a lot of them carried fire insurance policies. And their thinking was that it was cheaper in the long run to just build a frame house and insure it and hope for the best rather than to invest in brick and stone to begin with. And so to put in context the way of living with fire in the 19th century, most people hadn't experienced a devastating fire in their life. And the best analogy I can give you is that it's kind of like driving a car in our lives. Our lives are very dependent on cars and vehicles. We've all been in vehicles. We deal with vehicles every day. A lot of us have had fender benders, and we know safety features. Few of us have actually been in devastating car accidents or fatal car accidents. And so while the threat of a vehicular accident is always with us, there's a little piece in our minds that's like, it won't happen to us. And it was the same in the 19th century. They knew fires happened often. They lived with fire, but most people hadn't been the victim of a devastating fire. So they kind of thought like, yeah, it won't happen to me. I'll just go ahead and build in frame and wood and take my chances. So beyond that, there are things one could do to their house to minimize the risk of fire. One is a lightning rod. And this is something that not everyone is on board with. Again, it's an upfront cost that you have to put into your house. And, you just kind of think it won't happen to you, but a lot of houses did. And this image of the hotel on the top there is a really great example because you can see the 2 lightning rods and you can also see the grounding cables. So the thought is that the house will be struck by lightning and those grounding cables will transfer the electricity safely into the ground rather than burn your place down. Inside the house, one of the basic means of fire prevention is the hearth. And the hearth usually has a bricked-in area or a tiled-in area built around it. And this is, of course, to catch stray sparks. And then in front of it is the hearth rug. So here, these are images actually of the Lincoln home, and they've got an open fireplace, and they've got a stove in their fancy parlor, and they've got hearth rugs in front of both of them. And hearth rugs are not just pretty, they're also a secondary means of fire prevention in case a spark or a log should roll out of the fireplace, which did happen often. They would be caught by that rug, and the rug is almost always of wool, and wool is naturally fire retardant. It doesn't have much flame spread. It tends to smolder rather than flame. And everyone knew this, and that's why Catherine Beecher, in her domestic advice manual, advised her readers to keep young children in woolen dresses to save them from risk of fire. Wool is naturally flame resistant, and it doesn't melt or drip or stick to the skin when burned. So wool is such a, kind of good flame retardant and fire preventative material that people also were advised to keep woolen blankets on hand. And if there is a fire, to wrap a woolen blanket around you as you made your way out of the house in case sparks or falling embers or whatever were falling on you, so you wouldn't get singed or burned. You were also advised to, if you should catch on fire, which actually did happen to women wearing big hoop skirts around open flames, you're advised to find a wooden blanket and smother yourself with it rather than to run around. So basically stop, drop, and roll, or stop, grab yourself and wrap yourself in a wooden blanket, drop, and roll. And then people were also advised to keep buckets on hand. And Catherine Beecher again said, have 2 pails filled with water in the kitchen where they will not freeze. So just kind of, pre-fire extinguisher, have some water handy. And I think it's just an interesting little bit of insight into 19th century houses that she's saying, put them in the kitchen where they will not freeze. That tells you that there were parts of your house that could have been freezing where water would freeze. So that tells you about the efficiency of fireplaces and stoves in the 19th century. Later on, there were a bunch of products that hit the market that advertise themselves as fireproof or fire preventative. And when you get these colored advertisements later in the 19th century, advertisers got really creative with showing all these devastating scenes of fire to kind of push the idea that you needed their product. On the top left is this fire kindling kind of thing to put in your stove that would prevent it from blowing up right there and harming you and yourself and your cat. On the bottom is fire resistant paint. And you can see that the woman is fleeing her burning house for the safety of the house next door that was painted in fire resistant paint. And then the one on the right is the Gary iron roofing, and this is a fireproof roof. And you can't read what the people are saying, but there's a woman who's like dangling or throwing her baby out the window to safety, and she's saying, there goes the baby out. If I had a Gary roof, it would not have been dustly. And the fireman who's off to the left putting out the fire is saying, 2 o'clock in the morning, I could have had more sleep if this house was covered with Gary iron roof, which, isn't the most compelling argument for buying a iron roof to me. Probably the baby is more. And then if you really wanted to get into fire safety in the 19th century, there were some a little bit more obscure products like this Curator fire escape on the right, which is this complicated looking system of levers and pulleys that could theoretically be used to lower one from upper story windows. I don't know how many people actually bought or used that, but it was out there if you wanted it. And then in the early 1900s is when the fire extinguisher was developed. And so I just love that image on the bottom of the woman just kind of like really calmly putting out the fires in her drapes. I don't know how many times that actually happened in real life, but that was an available option as well. So despite all the best preventative measures out there, fires happened. And so I was digging my way through 19th century newspapers looking for examples of them, and they keep talking about destructive fires. This is a phrase that popped up a lot in the 19th century. And fires were a weekly occurrence, sometimes daily. They just happened, and it was a fact of life in the 19th century. So This isn't related to Illinois, but this is kind of one of the more tragic ones that caught my eye. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow lost his first wife. She died in childbirth, and then he married, after a long and dogged courtship, he married Frances Appleton in 1842, and they had many happy years together. And then in 1861, when Frances was 44, she was putting locks of her children's hair into an envelope and sealing it with wax. And the sources kind of dispute what happened. Some people say that a lit match fell into her lap. Others say that the candle fell into her lap. But Frances took fire, and she was badly burned. Longfellow came in and he tried to smother her with his rug and his body. And sadly, Frances died the next day from her injuries. And Longfellow himself was badly burned. And after that point, he always wore a beard to cover up the scars on his face he had received during the fire. And he went on and he mourned Frances for the rest of his life. He had been deeply devoted to her and was just kind of crushed by her death. This is a little tidbit that came out of the Chicago newspaper, and it talked about basically that ad where the stove blows up because they'd used kerosene oil to light the fire. That's exactly what happened to this family. And it talks about how Mrs. Doyle proceeded to light a fire in order to prepare supper. After usual custom, she placed the shavings and wood in the stove, poured the fluid from some vessel upon the fire. She's using a substance called camphene. And unhappily and unsuspected by her, some live coals had remained in the fire from a previous fire, and the fluid burst into flame, which running into the vessel in Mrs. Doyle's hands, exploded and covered her and her child who stood near with its burning contest. So poor Mrs. Doyle and her child died in that stove explosion. You see a lot of deaths due to camphene. It was also called burning fluid, and it was meant to be kind of like a cheaper, brighter alternative to whale oil, which was becoming more expensive at the time, and also a kind of cleaner alternative to lard or animal fats. It was very, very combustible, and if people tried to light or refill their lamps while they were still burning, oftentimes it would explode. And that's what happened to this young girl. Sounds like she was in service in a Delavan house. She was burned to death by the ignition of camphene in a can from which she was filling a lamp, the lamp burning at the time. The flesh literally dropped from her bones. So not a very pretty picture there. And then another new technology at the time, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. Gas lighting came into widespread use at about the middle of the 19th century. And when gas was installed in various cities and people started to get it in their homes and in public buildings, the newspapers often ran notices that told people, do not blow the light out when you want to extinguish it, but shut off the gas. And it's kind of a natural thing. You're used to blowing out candles or oil lamps, right? So you might blow off your gas. People had to be told not to do that and kind of nudged to remember. And sometimes they didn't. And the second notice below is a house blown up. And it says that a gas pipe leading to the house of Mr. Gorman had burst, and the escaped gas had filled an airtight cellar. In the morning, Mr. Gorman, having a light in his hand, opened the cellar door when he was forcibly thrown back, and then the entire house was blown to atoms. And you do see stories about that where the gas has been blown out, but it's still running, and it was odorless at the time. Odor was added later kind of to alert people. So if you walked into a closed room that had been filled with gas, pretty much that happened. This is an account from a woman named Mary Baker in Springfield, or about Mary Baker. And Mary is the woman in the middle. She's standing next to her husband, John Baker. And a letter from one of her friends in Springfield in 1875 says that poor Mary Baker has lost her home by fire. About 4 o'clock on Tuesday last, I heard the fire bells. It was John Baker's house, which had been entirely destroyed. It had made such headway that when Mary went to her room to gather what she could of her own and the children's clothing, a piece of plastering detached by the flames struck her upon the back, and she soon saw that it would be at the risk of her life if she remained another moment and escaped as rapidly as possible. and that fire was said to have started with a defective flue on her chimney. And Mary Baker, coincidentally, was Mary Lincoln's niece, wife of Abraham Lincoln, and Mary Lincoln had given Mary Baker several of her own dresses and several wonderful presents that burned up in that fire. And just as someone who has recently curated an exhibit on historic clothing, I think it's interesting that what Mary went into a burning house for was herself and her children's clothing, which sort of shows you the value of clothing. And she's probably also thinking about the labor that she's invested into that clothing and doesn't want to see all that go up in flames. Here's another instance from Springfield. I'm sorry, we're in Springfield, so many of the devastating fires I know are local to the area. This was the grandest mansion in town. This was the mansion, the private residence of the former Governor Joel Matson that he built for himself at an expense of $100,000 in 1856, when $100,000 is valued in the millions. It was kind of like the city point of pride that Springfield should have such a great, elegant residence. By 1873, the Matsons had moved out and their daughter and son-in-law were living there. So that's who R.E. Goodall is. It's their son-in-law. And they were away in January, and passersby happened to notice smoke coming out of the house, and they were alerted. There were some young ladies nearby who tried to start a bucket brigade to save the house, but it was too far gone. And so this magnificent house burned down. And in the meantime, people gathered on the streets were watching it burn, and people were actually going into this burning building and pulling out the governor's oil paintings and his books and some of his furniture. They even dragged out this marble statue of Stephen A. Douglas, which he had in his foyer and is now the property of the old state capitol here in Springfield. And that parlor chair, that ornately carved parlor chair, was saved from the fire as well. And this is now in the possession of the Illinois State Museum. So that's in our collection along with its mate. So these fires happened, and one thing to remember is that downtowns in 19th century towns tended to be a lot of frame buildings crowded close together. So once a fire started in one, it was very easy for them to leap to another building, and this would start a conflagration. And you see the word conflagration, it sounds like a kind of old-fashioned word for a fire. In 19th century parlance, it had sort of a specific meaning to a destructive fire that destroyed a lot of property damage. And these tended not to actually have a whole lot of loss of life, because these fires that burned down cities tended to happen at night in business districts when most people had gone home for the night. There's a ton of property damage, but not as much loss of life. Obviously, Chicago was an exception because it burned down so many residential areas and spread so far and wide. So let's talk about what one might do to fight a fire. So in the very beginning, and we're talking about Illinois here, so we're talking about the beginning of the 19th century, bucket brigades were the best way of fighting fire. There weren't a whole lot of real organized fire companies, and so it sort of was the job of private citizens to band together and put out fires. So people would have buckets. Generally, you would just kind of have one as an internal safety thing. Some cities actually had ordinances requiring people to have 2 buckets handy, and by handy, they usually meant hanging somewhere by the front door. And if you heard that a fire was going on, if the fire rattle sounded or the fire bells rang, then you were to report with your bucket, or at the very least, like, toss your bucket out the front door and let someone pick them up and use them. And so people would literally get in lines and go from the nearest well or cistern and pass buckets full of water to a burning building and then pass the empties back. And it really wasn't the most efficient means of putting out a fire. Usually the place that was on fire was kind of a loss, and they were just sort of wetting down the adjacent buildings to keep the fire from spreading. It's a neat little notice. This is in the wake of an 1850 3 fire in Springfield, where a Rastus Wright posts and says 30 fire buckets lost at the fire, 10 cents each to the boy who will bring them to my office. So after the fire, you know, if you've just tossed your bucket out and let it be used, you've got to get it back to you. That's why you put your name or initials onto it. And usually they were collected at some central place like a church or something, and you would go and get your fire bucket back after the fire. You've heard of hooks and ladders, and hooks and ladders are an important part of firefighter kind of ideology and lore today. A ladder was to get to a second level and rescue people and or property. The hook is to pull down adjacent buildings so the fire doesn't spread. So again, in these early days, once a fire starts, there's not a whole lot of chance of saving it if the fire gets to a certain point, and then your main goal becomes like making sure it doesn't spread and burn the whole house down or the whole town down. Then by about the middle of the 19th century in Illinois, you start to see in urban areas these volunteer firefighting companies formed. And this coincides with a move away from bucket brigades to pumper trucks. And so with a pumper truck, now you need this coordinated force of people who can bring the pumper truck out. Sometimes they're actually dragged by hand, not by horses. So you need people who can drag these pumper trucks out, who can operate them, which is really intense work, who can man the hoses. And so this was it was a really like macho thing. And there's this whole culture of these volunteer firefighting companies where people would organize themselves into companies. They would have a lot of like group pride. It was very much like this male club thing. They would want to see who got there the fastest. Sometimes rivalries sprung up because cities would incentivize getting to fires fast. So they would offer $5 to whichever company would get there first. And so that led to like physical brawls where people would literally fight each other to get down, get to town and get access to the well or the cistern or the water main. And people also like identified a lot with their fire companies, and there were parades and there were fundraising balls and society. And so it was really wrapped up in male identity and a little bit aggression as well. So here are some of the material culture associated with volunteer fire companies, which is awesome. So I mentioned that people organize themselves into companies, and there's a lot of pride about the company that you belong to. So the top hat was also called a parade hat. This was, so if you're at a chaotic fire where there's lots of companies responding, there's lots of people going around, your hat identifies you, you know, as part of a certain company. But they're also very fancy and beautiful. And so they like to parade a lot, you know, so at parades or kind of exhibition events, they're sort of part of the look, you know, they're part of your uniform. Same with the oil caps. The oil caps help to identify you as part of the capes. And the cape helped to identify you, but it also was a protective piece of equipment that you would wear around your shoulders, and that would, you know, help to save you from burning, you know, ash and cinder and whatever. The thing on the upper left is a bed key. And I thought this was kind of an urban myth, but it turns out that this was really kind of a key component to volunteer firefighting. A lot of times it was less of a put out the fire as a salvage mission where firefighters would go in and they would try to like take out and rescue as much of the valuable property as they could. And one of the most valuable things that people owned at the time was a bed. And so that's a bed key that firefighters could use to go into a house, break down the bed into its components, and haul away people's beds so it would be saved and they wouldn't lose this massive investment of furniture. The bottom thing is a speaking trumpet, and this is what the fire officials used to direct their company's efforts over the noise of a fire scene. And speaking trumpets also made these great presentation gifts. So when they're having their banquets and parades and everything, or if someone, you know, moved away, you would often engrave a silver trumpet and make a gift of it. And you can actually see it if we go back one. The guy who's standing in the middle here, he's got a speaking trumpet, and this guy does too. The Dalmatian. So the Dalmatian has a very specific reason for being associated with fire companies. Dalmatians are very compatible with horses, and actually a lot of Dalmatians started as stable dogs. So Dalmatians became associated with firefighters to guard their horses and their engines in the stables. When a fire was alerted and the company was going out, the Dalmatians would run next to the firefighting engine ahead of the horses and kind of clear the way for the horses. If the horses got spooked by the fire, the Dalmatians' presence could kind of distract and comfort them. And then the Dalmatians were also guard dogs who stood guard of the equipment to make sure that no one stole it or messed with it, especially if there's rival firefighting companies there. The Dalmatians are their guard dogs. And finally, the thing in the bottom right is a fire rattle, and this is the precursor to the fire siren. The fire companies would kind of just shake these rattles ahead of them as they're going down the street to alert people that there is a fire and basically to get out of the way. And so volunteer fire companies evolved into, these are the pumpers. So these were the point of pride of these volunteer fire companies. They were often sponsored by either private citizens would kind of contribute and raise funds to buy a pumper for the city, or the city itself might underwrite the pumper, but they were lavishly decorated. They had these brass fixtures. When you had a parade, you would always bring your pumper out for people to see. They would always have these demonstrations of, how far could their water shoot, and look at how fast we are. So it's really kind of the central point of pride here. They seem like a real, drag, pun intended, I guess, especially if there's not horses to drag them, because sometimes you are trying to drag by hand this huge heavy pumper wagon through streets that are filled with mud. And some of them you would just kind of you need the bucket brigade to fill up like a well or a cistern on the pumper truck. So you're still doing buckets and you're pumping, and it would take a lot of pumping, and the firefighters could only really operate it in short shifts before they got tired. So it was a lot better when the steam engine came along, but the steam engine also heralded the transition from the volunteer fire companies to the paid fire companies. So professional fire companies start to happen in the later 19th century, and this coincides with these steam engines. There's sort of just a general move towards professionalization that focuses more on training and training manuals and specific procedures, and people who are paid to do this job and available at all times, rather than volunteers who might be busy. It also coincides with the rise of more factory work. In the presence or in the past, volunteer fire companies might have been more people who were apprentices or working at a trade, or had occupations that let them drop things and go if there was a fire. As the Industrial Revolution takes hold and there's more factory work, people who might have been volunteer firefighters who are working in a factory can't just leave their machine and go if there's a fire. So these paid, always available fire companies start to be formed. So this is the 19th century, and unfortunately this means that this is an era of deep segregation. So there are segregated fire companies. Here in Springfield, we had an all-black fire company, engine number 5, and unfortunately they were given material that was often cast off from other firehouses, and they were required to stay and clean up after the fire was out. Engine number 5 actually showed up to the Springfield race riot in 1908 and was instrumental in trying to save a lot of the property that was destroyed at that time. And in Springfield, fire companies were not integrated until 1954, which is about the time frame for the rest of the state as well. And so again, coinciding with these professional fire companies is the adoption of the steam engine. And so a steam engine literally has pistons that are moving it and producing pressure that will propel the fire faster and farther than any hand pump could ever do. But it's also a technical piece of machinery that requires paid professionals who really understand the mechanics of it and how it works and can be ready at a moment's notice. And let's wrap up by talking about the aftermath of fires. Here's a little thing that was printed in a Chicago paper in the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire. It says, "Cheer up in the midst of a calamity without parallel in the world's history, looking upon the ashes of 30 years accumulations, the people of this once beautiful city have resolved that Chicago shall rise again." So the question is, what happens after a town has a devastating fire, or a city? And the short answer is, well, they build back generally. And oftentimes kind of early buildings, older buildings, outdated buildings, less safe buildings are replaced by more substantial buildings. So this is a view of the north side of the square in Springfield on the top from about 1850. All the low one-story buildings there are frame buildings. This side of the square was known as Chicken Row. It was kind of thought to be an eyesore because it's got these kind of small ramshackle wooden buildings. And someone said ultimately that our town will be benefited by fire, for before long we can expect to see fine, substantial brick buildings built in their place. So that's kind of the overarching goal. And what happens is that things do get built back and often better and more substantial, but it's not always that straightforward. So let's go back to Chicago and see like what actually happened in the wake of the Great Chicago Fire. So first of all, in the wake of this massive devastation where 100,000 people lost their homes, there are some people who just can't rebuild. A lot of people, ironically, had fire insurance policies that burned up in the fire, and so were unable to prove that they were insured, and so didn't get any compensation and couldn't afford to rebuild. And so a lot of people were, and small businesses were crowded out of Chicago altogether and just went and lived with relatives or restarted their life elsewhere. In the immediate aftermath of the Chicago fire, people built back what they knew. So, you know, it's a great ideal to like, okay, now we're going to all build back fireproof and better and brick, and this won't happen again. But the reality is, you know, you're in this charred, rubble, devastated city, and people want to get structures up. And so they build back in wood. There are temporary structures that are put up, and there are city regulations that mandate that these temporary buildings have to come down within a year, but they don't, you know, they stay up. And so there's this initial like, poof, like rebuilding. And this is a view of Old Town in Chicago, which was completely leveled by the fire and is one of those places that built back nearly identically to what it had looked like before. They were able to kind of maneuver around the city regulations that mandated building back fireproof. So what happened was, here's a little known fact. On July 14th, 1874, there was another huge Chicago fire. This one is not as famous. People don't know as much about it, but it burned 47 acres just south of the Loop and destroyed 812 structures. And so this is just less than 3 years after the Great Chicago Fire. The neighborhood that it was affected were a lot of Eastern European immigrants, as well as middle-class Black business and residential district. And actually this fire destroyed more than 80% of Black-owned property in the city. And so the people who lost their homes in this fire tended to move farther west and to the south. And so the south side of Chicago during the Great Migration was known as the Black Belt. This is sort of where people of color moved to and were later kind of restricted to by covenants and unfair housing practices. This is the start of it. It happened here because of this massive fire in 1874. So as a result of this second fire, so close on the heels of the Great Chicago Fire, the National Board of Underwriters of the fire insurance industry basically said, like, that is it. We are canceling all insurance in Chicago unless that Chicago bans the construction of wooden buildings within the city limits. if they enact stricter safety laws and kind of restructure the fire department. So a lot of fireproofing actually did happen in the wake of the second fire because the fire insurance companies were like, you know, that's it. This is 2 fires now. That's too many. And so people really had to rethink the way that they conceived of fireproof buildings. And there had been buildings prior to the Great Chicago Fire that were thought to be fireproof. And one of them is the Post Office and Customs House building. This was supposed to be a fireproof building. You can see by the second slide underneath that it was destroyed. It actually did fairly well. It held up against the fire for a long time, and the outside survived pretty well. But it was ignited. There was another building that kind of fell on it, and fire was allowed to get in kind of through the shutters and into the building and to breach the building's defenses. And so once the fire kind of got in the building, the inside, which has a lot of, you know, wood and combustible materials, went pretty quickly. So what happens is people start to build back in Chicago with terracotta, which means baked earth in Latin. And this is a clay-based glazed ceramic with a porous texture that's really able to withstand heat. And so you have the Northwestern Terracotta Company in Chicago, Illinois, that just takes off. And so there's this huge demand for fireproofing materials. The building on the bottom is the Palmer House Hotel, which actually opened 3 days before the Great Chicago Fire was damaged and was rebuilt with terracotta roofing materials. And another wonderful use of terracotta that people discovered was that it could help to fireproof a taller structure. And so now you have, later on in the 1880s, you have the rise of the Chicago School of Architecture, also known as the commercial style, where you have the first skyscraper. That home insurance building on the left side is thought to be the first skyscraper ever in Chicago. And so you use steel frame to build the buildings taller and lighter. And people discovered that if you encase those steel frames in terracotta or insulated fire material, then you can build higher. It's not just a matter of being able to build higher, but you have to like be able to resist heat and resist fire as well. And so eventually, Chicago does build back better. It took about 20 years after the Great Chicago Fire. And so by the 1890s, now we have the Columbian Exposition in 1893, the World's Fair. Of course, this isn't Chicago built back. These are all kind of temporary plaster buildings thrown up for the fair. But if you've heard of the World's Fair, part of it was to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's coming to the North American continent. But part of it is to make a declaration to the world that Chicago has risen from the ashes like a phoenix and is now ready to be a leader on the global stage. So after all that, I'm gonna wrap up my talking at you. Let's talk about fire. If anyone has any questions or comments or stories to share of a personal experience with a fire, I would love to hear them.
So if anyone wants to put a question in the question and answer, Erika will answer it. So go ahead and put any questions that you have in the question and answer. That's found in the lower portion of your
Okay, see that you mentioned that fires could be almost a daily thing. Was that true within Springfield as well? Yes, and especially during the summer or when things were dry. And it's not an absolute, you know, sometimes like every day you could see like there was a fire, and it's not like they're all like the city burns down every day. A lot of times it's like, you know, so-and-so's barn caught fire, but people were able to put it out, or, you know, so-and-so had a small fire in their upstairs bedroom. And then sometimes it's someone's house burned down, and sometimes it's, you know, like a city block burned down. So you do see a lot of notices in the paper, but kind of seasonal, depending on, you know, the weather and the dryness.
Does anyone have any more questions? No? Okay. Well then, thank you all very much for attending tonight. Oh, it looks like we have one question, another question. For families to recover, were there aid societies?
Yeah, that is a great question. And there were, and a lot of times it is like church-based. A lot of times if it's a kind of like a widespread fire in town, then people will donate. Like in the Chicago fire, people donated goods and money and supplies from all over the country, and the train tracks were undamaged in the fire, so things were pouring in from all over the country. And some of the survivors wrote like, you know, we're getting helped a lot, this is great. If it's the case of an individual, like an individual family's house burns down, they might, you know, there might be some sort of like local church assistance. Sometimes they're just kind of on their own though, you know, they just have to like move in with relatives. So it sort of depended community by community, and who they knew, you know, how connected they were in town, and the extent of the devastation of the fire.
All right, well, thank you, Erika, for your great presentation. I know I learned a lot. And thank you all for attending tonight. I hope you enjoyed it as well.